Welcome to Libyth. I'm glad you're here. We are continuing our series on the Pillow Book, and today we are going to talk about the people in the book. But I want to begin by complicating the word characters, because character, in the sense that we use it when we talk about novels, implies a certain kind of entity, someone who has an inner life, someone who changes, someone whose development is part of what the story is about. The Pillow Book does not really have characters in that sense. What it has is something more interesting. A narrator who is the most fully constructed presence in any text from this era, surrounded by figures who function less as individuals than as cases. Occasions for observation, examples of refinement achieved or failed, instruments that the narrator uses to take the temperature of the world around her. The narrator herself is the place to start, because she is the center of gravity of the entire book, and yet she is also, in a specific and interesting way, a construction. Say Shōnagon, the person who held the brush, the person who lived in Teishi's court, the person who had a father named Kiyohara no Madasuke, and a domestic life that she keeps in shadow, is not exactly the same as the narrator of the Pillow Book. The narrator is a persona, a carefully assembled performance of a particular kind of self. She is witty, confident, precise, slightly merciless, alive to beauty, impatient with failure, certain of her own taste, and almost never caught in a moment of genuine uncertainty. She is, in other words, exactly the person you would construct if you were someone who felt perpetually uncertain about her social position and needed to establish, through the sheer authority of her voice, that she deserved to be taken seriously. The wit is not just personality. It is identity. Shōnagon the narrator has organized herself around the capacity for quick, precise, aesthetically correct response to whatever situation presents itself. This is partly the Heian ideal of cultural competence. The court expected this of everyone who moved in its circles, but in Shonagon, it reaches an intensity that goes beyond the expected. She is not performing cultural competence because the court requires it. She has fused her selfhood with it. To be witty, in the world of the Pillow Book, is to be. The wit is what she is, not what she does. And this means that the book, as a display of wit, as a record of precisely observed moments, sharply formulated opinions, perfectly calibrated responses, is also a continuous act of self-creation. Every sentence is Shōnagon making herself. What she hides is equally interesting. The book almost never shows her caught off guard. There are one or two scenes, moments of genuine vulnerability, moments where something breaks through the polished surface, and they have an extraordinary power precisely because of how rare they are. There is a scene in which she weeps in a way she cannot quite control, and the weeping feels like a window into a self that the book otherwise keeps locked. There are moments of longing for Teishi, for the lost world of the court at its peak, for something the text never quite names, that arrive unexpectedly in the middle of a list of beautiful things or an account of someone's tasteful behavior. These moments are the fault lines in the persona, places where the construction of the self as wit gives way briefly to something less guarded, less perfect, more true. They are never dwelt upon. The persona reassembles itself quickly. But they are there, and they are the proof that the persona is constructed over something real. Now, Empress Teishi. Teishi is the figure around whom the book is organized, the presiding presence, the woman whose grace and beauty and wit constitute the standard against which everything else in the court is measured. Shōnagon's portrayal of Teishi is idealizing. This is well understood, and it should be understood, but the idealization is not empty. Teishi appears in the book as genuinely gifted, quick-witted, generous, cultivated, responsive to beauty, capable of the kind of spontaneous, poetic intelligence that the Heian court valued above almost everything else. She is described in specific scenes, not just in general terms, and the scenes are persuasive because they are particular. This is not a portrait of the perfect empress in the abstract. It is a portrait of a specific woman doing specific things beautifully. But Teishi is also, and this is what gives the portrait its depth, a political loser. Her brother Korechika's exile in 996 removed the political protection that had made her position secure. Michinaga's placement of his daughter Shoshi as a rival consort began the slow process of Teishi's marginalization. The emperor loved her, that is not in doubt, and it comes through in the book, but love in this system was not a form of political protection. The political structure operated through clan power and factional strength, and Teishi's clan had been broken, and her factional protector had been removed. She was beautiful and beloved and politically defenseless, and this combination, the height of aesthetic achievement combined with the structure of vulnerability, is what makes her the emotional center of the book. Shonagon's loyalty to Teishi after the political collapse is the book's most politically significant act. She does not leave. She does not switch allegiance to the Shoshi faction, which would have been the pragmatic move, the survival move, the move that most people in her position would have made. She stays. She continues to write about Teishi's court as the most beautiful place in the world. She continues to record its moments of grace and wit, and shared laughter with the same loving attention she brought to it when it was politically secure. This loyalty is not just personal feeling, it is a political position. It is a refusal to let the political defeat be total, a claim that what Teishi's court was aesthetically, humanly, cannot be erased by the factional triumph of Michinaga. The book is, among other things, the monument that Shonagon built to the world that Michinaga's politics destroyed. Emperor Ichijō moves through the book as a revered, slightly distant, sacred presence. He appears in scenes, listening to music, appreciating a poem, responding to an unexpected piece of wit with evident pleasure. But he is always on the far side of a certain distance, a figure who cannot be fully approached because his sacredness makes full approach inappropriate. Shonagon's treatment of him is admiring, even slightly odd, and it renders him more as an atmosphere than a person. The quality of imperial presence, the weight of sacred authority, rather than an individual with an inner life. He is the center that cannot be held. He is where all the factional maneuvering leads, his approval, his favor, his attention. And he is also, in a deeper sense, the emptiness at the center of the system, the sacred figure around whom everything revolves without him being, in any practical sense, the one who decides. Fujiwara no Korechika appears in the book as a brilliant and doomed man, gifted, dazzling, politically overmatched. He was, by all accounts, genuinely accomplished. A poet, a presence, a man of real intellectual force. And he was, by the particular viciousness of Heian factional politics, destroyed. His exile in 996 was the event that changed everything in Shonagon's world. And you can feel its weight in the text even where it is not directly referenced. The scenes involving Korechika before his fall have a quality of not quite valediction, but something adjacent to it. They are records of a brilliance that the reader, who knows what happened next, can only receive as tragedy. He functions in the book as the type of the golden man who falls, the figure who has everything the culture values: birth, wit, cultivation, charm, and who is destroyed not by any failure of these qualities, but by the crude mechanics of political competition. He is the proof that the beautiful world is fragile, that the system that produces it is also the system that can smash it at any moment, for reasons that have nothing to do with desert. The minor courtiers, the men and women who move through the scenes and episodes in unnamed or lightly named forms, function as what I called earlier cases. They are not characters in any developed sense. They are examples, types, specimens. The man who construction that appears throughout the book, a man who has stayed too long at a party, a man who quotes a poem incorrectly, a man who makes too much noise when he arrives at someone's chambers in the night, strips individual identity away and replaces it with a category. The specific person becomes a type. And this is not because Shonagon is lazy or incapable of individualization. The portraits of Teishi and Korechika show she can individualize when she chooses, but because the function of these figures is not to be people, but to be cases for the operation of her judgment. They are the raw material that the machine of Shonagon's observation processes into aesthetic and moral conclusions. The treatment of servants and low-status figures is the place in the book that makes the contemporary reader most uncomfortable, and I think it is worth sitting with that discomfort rather than rushing past it. Shonagon's snobbery toward people below her own rank is not incidental to the book. It is structural. Her sense of herself as refined, cultivated, and deserving of the court world she moves in is partly constituted by her contempt for people who fail to meet the standards she has internalized. The servant who behaves stupidly, the low-ranking person who is visible in a space where they should be invisible, the figure who lacks the cultural competence that Shonagon has worked so hard to acquire. These people are vehicles for a contempt that is also, if you look at it from below, a defense. Shonagon is not that far above the servant class in any absolute sense. Her father was a provincial governor, educated but not noble, wealthy but without lineage. The cruelty toward those below her is the cruelty of someone maintaining the fragile distinction between herself and the abyss beneath. This is not a defense of the cruelty. It is an explanation of it, which is not the same thing. The book's moral limits are real, and they are the moral limits of its historical moment and social position, and acknowledging them is part of reading it honestly. What is also true is that those moral limits do not prevent the book from being one of the most extraordinary documents of human consciousness ever produced. Both things are true simultaneously, and holding both things is the basic task of reading an old book carefully. Next, we examine what the book means beneath its surface, and then we move into the themes. I'll see you there. That's all for today on Libyth. If you want to follow the whole journey, subscribe, a new book every week.